I was emptying the recycling bin near the service elevator when she walked in for the first time. She had that particular kind of confidence that comes not from what you've done, but from what you assume about yourself. Heels clicking on the lobby tile, chin just a degree too high, eyes scanning the space like she was already calculating its value. My daughter, Carolyn, was holding her arm, laughing at something she'd said, and I remember thinking, she is beautiful, and she knows it, and somewhere in that knowledge there is a door that hasn't been opened yet. I kept my head down and reached for the next bin. My name is Gerald Whitmore. I'm 63 years old. I've lived in Ottawa my entire life, minus 4 years in Kingston for school and 2 in Toronto that I'd rather forget. I have one daughter, Carolyn, who is 31 and has her mother's laugh, and thankfully, her mother's instincts most of the time. I have a house in Westboro that my late wife, Patricia, picked out herself. And I have a building. The building is on Sparks Street, 12 stories, mixed commercial and residential, built in 1987, renovated twice since then. I bought it when I was 41 with money. I'd saved over 20 years of quiet decisions, some legal work early on, then property management consulting, then a few purchases that compounded into something I never felt the need to announce. I kept an office on the 11th floor, but most days I preferred the main floor. I liked being in the building. I liked knowing how things worked. I liked talking to the tenants, so I wore the uniform, not because I was hiding. Exactly. When I first started coming in regularly after Patricia passed, I needed something to do with my hands. The building manager, a man named Don Sutherland, who has worked for me for 11 years, offered to set me up a proper executive office with a view. I told him I'd rather fix the boiler. He laughed. I wasn't entirely joking. Over time, it became routine. I wore the gray shirt and the dark pants. I learned the HVAC system better than any technician I'd hired. I knew which unit had the leaking radiator in January, which hallway light buzzed after 11 p.m. I knew the names of every tenant. I knew when Mrs. Okafor on the 8th floor was having her grandchildren visit because she'd asked me to check the window latch in the second bedroom. I knew that Mr. Lefebvre on the 3rd floor kept a bicycle he never rode, but polished every Sunday morning. I was not hiding. I was just present, in a way that suited me. Carolyn knew I owned property. She knew I was comfortable. But she was 26 when Patricia died, already living her own life, and we had the kind of relationship where we talked about real things but didn't always talk about numbers. She knew her father worked. She assumed he managed some rentals. She didn't ask specifics and I didn't volunteer them. It was not deception. It was simply the absence of a conversation we hadn't gotten around to yet. Her name was Melissa Holt. She was 30, a marketing director at a mid-sized firm on Albert Street, and she had met Carolyn at a fundraiser for the Children's Hospital 18 months before I first saw her in my lobby. They had been inseparable since. I understood why. Melissa was charming, quick, funny, in a sharp way that made rooms pay attention to her. She was also the kind of person who sorted people quietly and immediately into categories useful, neutral, beneath notice, and once she'd sorted you, she rarely revised her assessment. She sorted me the first time. She looked up from her phone and realized I was Carolyn's father. "Oh," she said, and I could hear the adjustment in that single syllable. Not rude, just recalibrated. Carolyn mentioned, "You worked in property." "I do," I said, and I extended my hand, and she shook it the way people shake hands when they're being polite but have already moved on. That was in March. By June, she and Carolyn were engaged. I found out when Carolyn called me on a Wednesday evening, her voice bright and breathless in the way it used to be when she was small and had something to show me. I was genuinely happy. I told her so. I asked about the proposal. I asked if she was sure. She said yes to all of it, laughing, and I believed her. The engagement dinner was at Melissa's parents' home in Rockcliffe Park. Large house, careful garden, the kind of furniture that signals money without mentioning it. Her father, Douglas Holt, was a senior partner at a downtown firm. Her mother, Catherine, had been a pediatric surgeon for 30 years before stepping back to a consulting role. They were gracious, well-practiced hosts, and they looked at me with the specific warmth people extend to those they consider harmless. I wore a blazer. I brought wine. I sat where I was put. Dinner was pleasant until Douglas asked what I did. I said I was in property management. He nodded the way people nod when they've heard an answer they expected and found it sufficient. "Commercial or residential?" "Both," I said. Maintenance side or management? I paused just long enough to be accurate. Both, I said again. He moved on to something else. I noticed Melissa watching me from across the table with an expression I couldn't quite read, not unkind, but assessing, like she was confirming something she had already decided. After dinner, while the women were in the kitchen and Douglas had gone to take a call, Melissa's younger brother, a 25-year-old named Brandon who had the easy arrogance of someone who had never needed to earn anything in front of anyone, leaned toward me and said, "So you're the building guy." "I suppose so," I said. He smiled, like that settled it. I drove home that night and stood in my kitchen for a long time before making tea. I wasn't angry. I want to be clear about that. I was not angry in the way people expect you to be angry when they hear a story like this. I was more curious. I was watching something unfold at a pace I recognized. I had seen it before, in different rooms, with different people. Assumptions move fast. The truth moves slowly. Patience is not passivity. It is simply the discipline to let things arrive in their own time. What I did not do was correct the assumption. Not that night. Not in the weeks that followed. In some ways, I am accountable for that. My daughter deserved to know who her father was, fully, before she stood at an altar with someone who had decided I wasn't worth knowing. I've thought about this a great deal. I've talked to my sister about it. I don't have a clean defense. What I have is this. I had spent 2 years becoming invisible in that building because it gave me peace after Patricia died, and somewhere in that invisibility I had also started to see people very clearly. I was not ready to stop seeing. So I watched. Midsummer. Carolyn had come to the building to drop off some paperwork for Dawn. She did this occasionally. Didn't think much of it. Assumed it was admin related to whatever rental work her father handled. She was in the lobby talking to me, leaning against the front desk with her coffee, telling me about the wedding venue they'd looked at in Gatineau when Melissa arrived to pick her up. Melissa walked in, took in the scene, her fiancé talking to the man in the gray maintenance shirt, and said, without lowering her voice, "Caro, whenever you're done chatting with the staff." Carolyn's face changed for just a moment, a small tightening around the eyes. Then she laughed it off and said goodbye to me, and they left together. I stood in the lobby for a moment after the door closed. Don came out of the back office and stood next to me. He'd heard everything. Don always hears everything. It's one of the reasons I've kept him for 11 years. "You going to let that go on?" he said. "For now," I said. He made a sound that meant he disagreed but wouldn't push it. Then he went back to his office. September. The wedding planning was in full motion. Carolyn came for Sunday dinners and showed me seating charts and fabric swatches, and I listened and asked questions, and she was happy in the way that made me decide, over and over, to keep waiting. One of those Sundays she mentioned that the wedding program was going to list family members with a brief description. Melissa had suggested it. "Nice touch," she said, so guests could understand who everyone was. I told Carolyn that was a fine idea. She said she'd written something for me but wanted me to see it. She pulled out a draft on her phone. For her father, the program read, "Gerald, Carolyn's dad, works in building services in Ottawa, loves hockey and terrible puns." I read it twice. Loves hockey and terrible puns. Both true. Building services. Also, technically, true. I handed her back her phone and said it was perfect. She looked relieved in a way that told me she'd been a little nervous showing me. That small nervousness told me more than the words did. I asked her, gently, whether Melissa knew much about my work. She shrugged in a way that wasn't quite a shrug. "She knows you do property stuff. I think she figures it's, small scale." "Does that bother you?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. That was its own answer. "She respects hard work," Carolyn said finally. She grew up in a certain world." I nodded. I didn't say anything else, but I filed it away in the part of my mind where I keep things that matter. The wedding was in October, out near Perth, at a venue on the water. It was a genuinely beautiful day, the kind of fall afternoon that makes you understand why people live in this country, despite everything, the light coming through the maples at a low angle, the river going silver in the afternoon. 120 guests. Open bar. A band that knew what they were doing. I wore the suit Patricia had bought me for Carolyn's university graduation, the one she'd insisted on, the dark charcoal with the faint stripe. I stood at the back of the ceremony with my hands folded, watching my daughter walk toward someone she loved, and I felt the full weight of that moment without anything complicated in it. The reception was where the complications lived. The seating arrangement had me at a table near the back, table 14, with some of Carolyn's colleagues from her early career who were kind people and perfectly good company. Melissa's immediate family, parents, brother, and aunt occupied the front tables. The head table, of course, was the wedding party. I found my seat and sat down and introduced myself to the people around me, and we had a fine conversation about nothing in particular while the room filled. Then came the speeches. Douglas gave a speech about his daughter. It was warm, practiced, and ran about 6 minutes. He talked about Melissa's ambition, her brilliance, her heart. He raised his glass and the room raised theirs. Then Melissa's brother Brandon stood up. He talked about the couple's first meeting. He talked about how Melissa had come home and said she'd met the woman she wanted to be with. He talked about the future they were building. Then he said, in closing, that he also wanted to acknowledge the family that Carolyn was bringing to the table, to honor the people who had shaped her. Unfortunately, he said, Carolyn's dad couldn't make it up here tonight, but he's definitely here in spirit. He raised his glass. A few people looked around. Someone near table 14 turned and smiled at me uncertainly. I was sitting 8 feet away. I raised my glass along with everyone else. I kept my face still. I took a sip of the wine, which was good. Someone had made a decent decision there, and I set the glass down and looked at the centerpiece and let the moment pass through me without catching on anything. The person sitting beside me, one of Carolyn's former colleagues, a young woman named Priya who clearly hadn't been briefed, leaned over and whispered, "Are you Gerald?" "I am," I said quietly. She looked at the head table, then back at me. "Did he just—" "It's fine," I said. "That's not—" "It's fine," I said again, and I meant it. Not because it didn't sting. It did. It stung in the specific way that things sting when they confirm what you already knew. But I had made a choice that night to be present for my daughter's wedding and not for my own dignity, and that choice was still the right one. Carolyn found me after dinner, before the dancing started. She came to table 14 with her dress gathered in one hand, and she hugged me and said she was sorry and that she hadn't known Brandon was going to say that. I held her for a moment and told her the food was excellent and that she looked like her mother. She pulled back and looked at me with Patricia's eyes and said, "Dad, are you okay?" "I'm very okay," I said. And that was also true. We danced once, Carolyn and I, to the song Patricia and I had danced to at our own wedding 34 years ago, which Carolyn had arranged without telling me, and by the time it was over, I had stopped thinking about Brandon's speech entirely. I drove home alone at midnight. The highway was empty and the fields were dark, and the radio played something I didn't know. I thought about Patricia. I thought about patience. I thought about the building on Sparks Street, with its 12 floors and its slow boiler, and its tenants who knew me as Gerald from maintenance. I thought, not yet, but soon. Winter moved through Ottawa the way it always does without apology. The newlyweds had settled into an apartment in Centertown. Sunday dinners with Carolyn continued. Melissa joined occasionally, and when she did, she was pleasant in the careful way of someone who has made a private assessment and is performing something more generous than she actually feels. She called me Gerald. She asked polite questions. She did not ask follow-up questions. In February, Carolyn told me they were looking at buying a condo. She was excited. She asked if I had any advice about the market. I told her to look carefully at what the building fees covered, to ask about reserve funds, to read the status certificate before signing anything. She laughed. "Dad, how do you know about reserve funds?" "I've been around buildings a long time," I said. Melissa, who was in the kitchen at the time, called out, "He means he's seen a lot of maintenance problems." She laughed as she said it. So did Carolyn. It was not malicious. I want to be fair about that. It was the laugh of two people who had a shared private understanding, and I was the subject of it, and they were comfortable enough to let me hear it. I looked at the table and said nothing. But I did think, soon. The thing that changed everything was not something I planned. I want to be clear about that too. There are versions of this story where the father engineers the reveal, sets the trap, waits for the perfect moment and springs it. That is not what happened. What happened is that Melissa's firm lost a significant contract in the spring, and the partners decided to expand by bringing in a commercial property management account. Her supervisor asked her to lead the pitch. It was a substantial opportunity, a 12-story mixed-use building on Sparks Street that the owner had quietly put out for bids on a new full-service management contract. She did her research. She prepared a proposal. She booked a meeting. I found out from Don on a Tuesday morning. He came into the main floor storage room where I was checking the water pressure on the east risers, and he stood in the doorway with the kind of expression people wear when they're trying not to enjoy something they are absolutely enjoying. "You have a meeting Thursday," he said. "I know," I said. "The Thompson account." "Before that," he said. 10 a.m. proposal meeting. New management contract pitch. I looked at him. He handed me the printed booking request. Company name. Contact name. Melissa Holt, Marketing Director. I stood there for a long moment with the paper in my hand and the sound of water moving through old pipes in the walls around me. "Do you want me to reschedule?" Don asked. "No," I said. "I'll take it." Thursday morning I was up at 6. I showered and dressed in the suit I keep for meetings, not the charcoal wedding one, the navy one, the one my accountant once told me made me look like a federal judge, which I had found more amusing then than I did now. I drove to the building and took the elevator to the 11th floor. The 11th floor was different from the rest of the building. It was where the building's administrative offices were, and where I kept my own office properly furnished, with the files and the certificates and the framed photo of Patricia on the credenza behind the desk, and the window that looked west over the city toward the river and, on clear days, the Gatineau Hills beyond. Don had prepared the boardroom next door. Water on the table, copies of the building specs, the proposal evaluation criteria we used for any service contract this size. At 5 minutes to 10, I sat down at the head of the table and opened my notebook. At 3 minutes past 10, the elevator opened and I heard Don greeting someone in the hall. I heard Melissa's voice, bright, professional, the register she used in work contexts, which I recognized from the one dinner party of Carolyn's I'd attended where she'd talked about her career. I heard the sound of a portfolio case being set on the floor outside the boardroom door. Then Dawn opened the door. She came in already talking, already reaching across the table to hand a folder to whoever was sitting there, and then she saw me, and the folder was in her extended hand, and her sentence stopped mid-word. I looked at her without expression, not coldly, not with satisfaction, simply present. The folder was still in her hand. I reached out and took it. "Good morning, Melissa," I said. "Please, sit down." She sat. She sat the way people sit when the floor has just moved under them, but they've decided to pretend it hasn't. She set her portfolio case on the table. She opened it. Her hands were steady. I gave her credit for that. "I didn't know," she said, before she'd said anything else. "I know," I said. "I mean, Carolyn never." "She didn't know the full picture either," I said. "That's on me, not her." She looked at the file in front of her, and then at me, and then at the window. Outside, the city moved in the quiet way cities move on a Thursday morning in early spring. Someone was walking a dog far below. A streetcar was turning the corner. "Do you want me to leave?" she said. "Not unless you want to," I said. "You prepared a proposal. I'd like to hear it." She looked at me again. This time there was something different in it, the layer under the composure, the one people don't usually let you see. It was not quite shame. It was more like recognition. The specific recognition of a person who has been operating on an assumption and has just discovered the assumption was wrong in every direction. She presented her proposal. It was good work, clear structure, competitive pricing, solid track record from her firm. I listened the way I always listen, fully, without letting what I felt personally touch what I heard professionally. When she finished, I asked 3 questions about emergency response protocols, about how they handled tenant communications during capital repairs, about their reporting schedule. She answered all 3 well. At the end, I told her I'd review it with Don and she'd hear from us within the week. She gathered her materials. She stood. At the door, she stopped. "Gerald," she said. "Yes." She didn't say anything for a moment. The space between us held a lot of things that neither of us had said out loud, and I think we both knew that a boardroom on a Thursday morning was not where they would be said. I've been unkind," she said. "I made assumptions. I'm sorry. I considered that. I considered the lobby, and the dinner in Rockcliffe, and the Sunday comment from the kitchen, and Brandon and his raised glass, and the empty space at table 14. I appreciate that," I said. "It takes something to say that." She nodded. Then she left. I sat in the boardroom for a while after she went. The city moved below. The river was visible, just barely, as a brightness beyond the buildings to the south. I called Carolyn that evening. She answered on the second ring. the way she always does when she sees it's me. I told her I had something to tell her, and that I should have told her sooner, and that I was sorry I hadn't. I told her about the building. I told her about the other properties. I told her about the meetings I'd been taking in the Navy suit on floors she hadn't known existed. I told her about her mother knowing, and being the one who told me, years ago, to keep doing the work I loved, even if the work looked different to other people. She was quiet for a long time when I finished. Then she said, "Dad, the maintenance uniform." "Yes. The boiler needed someone who cared," I said. She laughed. It was a complicated laugh, the kind that has several things in it at once, and then it stopped, and she was quiet again. "Did Melissa know? When she went to pitch the contract?" "No," I said, "not until she walked into the room." Another long silence. "That must have been something," she said. "She handled it well," I said, and I meant that sincerely. "She's not a bad person, Carolyn. I want you to know I don't think that. She had assumptions that went unchallenged for too long. Some of that is my fault." "Not all of it," Carolyn said. "No," I agreed. "Not all of it." We talked for a long time that night, the longest we had talked in years, maybe since the weeks after Patricia died, when we'd sit up late in the Westboro house, just keeping each other company. She asked about the properties. She asked about the legal work I'd done early on. She asked what her mother had thought about all of it. I told her that her mother had thought it was all very funny and very typical of me, and had made me promise to eventually tell the whole story at a family dinner where she could watch people's faces. I hadn't done that yet. I told Carolyn I still owed her mother that dinner. She was crying a little by then, and so was I, and we stayed on the phone for another half hour, not saying much of anything, just present with each other across the distance. The contract went to a different firm. In the end, one with more experience in heritage building, retrofitting, which was a genuine operational need I'd identified. Melissa's proposal was the second strongest, and I noted that in the file. When her supervisor called to ask for feedback, I gave it honestly and professionally, and said her team should apply again when the next contract cycle opened. I don't know exactly what Melissa told Carolyn about the meeting. I didn't ask. What I know is that things shifted slowly, the way real things shift. There were dinners where Melissa asked me questions and waited for the answers. There were conversations where she stopped performing and started listening. There was a Sunday in November when she helped me fix the running toilet in my upstairs bathroom, and I showed her how to replace the flapper valve, and she said, "How do you know how to do this?" And I said, "You learn what you need to learn." And she nodded like that meant something to her. I think it did. I think that's the part that matters. More than any boardroom moment. Not the reveal, the revision, the slow, effortful work of looking at someone again. Carolyn asked me once, after all of it had settled, whether I regretted not saying something sooner. I told her yes, in part. I told her there are things I'd do differently. I would have had the real conversation with her earlier, regardless of anything else. She deserved to know her father fully, and I let my own preferences come before that, and that was not right. But I also told her that I believe some things only become visible when you stop performing what you think you are. That the gray shirt and the concrete floor and the sound of old pipes in the walls taught me more about my own building and about the people in it than any office ever could have. That Patricia was right. The work you do when nobody is watching is the truest work. That what you own is not who you are, but neither is what you wear or how you get to a room. That how you treat someone when you've decided they don't matter, that is who you are. That is the only thing, in my experience, that doesn't change when the room does. Melissa knows that now. I believe she carries it. My daughter is happy, and she is loved, and she knows her father. All of him. The boiler and the boardroom and the bad puns and the navy suit and the charcoal one and the man underneath all of it who has been missing Patricia Whitmore every single day for 7 years and trying, in the best way he knows how, to be someone she would still recognize. I think he is. I think she would. I was in the building last Tuesday, checking the updated insulation on the 6th floor east wall, when a young woman moved, in new tenant, first apartment, boxes still in the hall. She looked at me and said, "Excuse me, do you work here?" I said I did. She asked if there was parking for a bicycle. I showed her where it was. She said thank you, and I said welcome to the building, and I meant it as much as I've ever meant anything. Some people learn early that every person in a room deserves your full attention, regardless of what they're wearing or what floor they got off on. Some people learn it later. Some people never learn it at all. And that is the real poverty, not of money, but of seeing. The label on someone's shirt tells you what they're doing that day. It tells you nothing about who they are, what they've built, what they've lost, or what they understand about the world that you might spend a lifetime trying to learn. The wisest thing Patricia ever said to me, and she said many wise things, more than I can count, was this: earn people's respect as if you have nothing, and you'll never mistake their respect for something they owe you. I've been trying to live inside that sentence ever since. I think I'm getting closer.